Okay, the design elements then. Part of the challenge in here is to split the organization design. As I mentioned earlier, the traditional hierarchy is trying to do multiple things within the same structure. The challenge then is, how do you organize around work instead of organizing around control? Now, even within a distributed or a networked organization, there is some stability at a snapshot in time. The key is, how easy is it to modify that? And that is part of designing change into the organization itself. Going further then is the control processes and the change processes need to be formalized as a separate focus. The second and third order of control and change is actually a separate and recognized focus of the organization and not an afterthought. Too often this comes as an afterthought when problems become a crisis, long after the symptoms of the core problem have been recognized by people throughout the organization, or it comes through an annual process, maybe through strategy consideration. Again, it is oftentimes pushed into the same organization and not dealt with until it has to be dealt with, or as a routine annual process, which oftentimes is basically a rubber stamp of what happened the year before and not a true thought process of what the organization changes are needed. So if we were to take a look then around organizing around control, let's take a look at how traditional organizations evolve over time and what happens with the control function. Looking at a startup organization, a general small startup is built around a single person or a small team. This is what would be called a traditional hub and spoke type of model, where there is a control. The control is centralized and then delegated throughout the rest of the organization. But again, that control is very manageable because the organization is small and the number of issues coming forward to that point is rather controllable itself. Going forward though, with that growth, that center then becomes the top of a traditional hierarchy or a pyramid structure, and the direct reports then start adding more complexity. The challenge then is, when that shift in structure occurs, what happens to the control? Traditionally, what happens is what had been control point that's embedded in the hub now becomes delegated control throughout the organization. That is what traditionally happens because the whole thought process is around controlling the operation. The person or the team that had been in a central point naturally continues with that same, but they can't handle everything, so they start delegating. But what they're delegating is not decision rights as much as they're delegating control of those decision rights. Going back as a different point of view though, let's talk about effectuation versus causation. Effectuation comes from the theory of effectuation, which is the study of successful entrepreneurship. It's how entrepreneurs are able to move forward with limited means. Within a more traditional management structure, it's causation. You move forward with necessity of control. Within this, then, we've taken a look at entrepreneurs are taking action with what they have. They are basically looking at the means and then evaluating what goals are possible from those means. That's very different from a causation thought process that looks at the goals, identifies the gap, and then the resources, and proceeds to acquire those necessary resources. The difference then is that entrepreneurs move quickly because they're taking action as they can. They're controlling their future with what they have available to them, where other organizations get slowed down because they're having to look at what resources that they need to go forward to meet their needs. Risk is also very different here in that a growing larger organization has risk management as a key function with an expectation of a return. Entrepreneurs are much more risk-taking, but they manage that risk very differently. They look at the risk as an affordable loss. And we saw this with the Gore structure earlier, in that you could take risks, particularly if you're learning new technology, new opportunities, but you only take those risks to the extent that you can afford the loss if it doesn't work. The key then is how to reduce that risk, which is often done through partnerships. Instead of building all resources themselves, smaller organizations partner and they build in additional means to go forward through those partnerships. This is the way Hire really operates. They offload much of their risk through their partners, but they build into those contractual relationships a way that if it's successful, they can then buy into more of that partner operation. So effectively, they're able to offload some risk, but then buy back. But they're not going to get the full return themselves, but they reduce the risk greatly to the entity and are able to move quicker because they don't have to acquire those resources themselves. There's also a difference of how you look at surprises. Entrepreneurs are constantly testing things, trying, quickly eliminating what doesn't work, building on what does work. These are surprises that organizations larger with a traditional hierarchy really don't like. Nobody likes to surprise or see surprises or have to bring surprises forward into the organization because the reward structure is not designed to reward failure. It's rewarding success, but you can't often get success without having some failure along the way. So the traditional hierarchy almost builds in a risk avoidance process where effectuation builds in a risk acceptance if the loss is affordable. Looking then about organizing around work. Before we were talking about organizing around control, now let's talk about how some of these organizations organize around work. A typical network structure, and this would be typical of a Hire network structure, where they've got multiple micro enterprises, small teams or small entities working as if they were separate organizations. In this particular example here, you've got a value chain of manufacturing 1 doing components to feed manufacturing 2 that then feeds sales to eventual distribution to the customers. So what could be considered one particular organization within Hire is actually split into 3 separate operations with relationships between those 3. At the same time, staff functions such as IT and HR will serve as micro enterprises to those organizations. Within the Hire group, those are contractual relationships, and any micro enterprise can choose to use an internal source or they can go outside. So if manufacturing 1 group is not getting the support that they think they need from IT, they can go and hire an outside IT organization, or they can maybe merge some of their thought process between manufacturing 1 and manufacturing 2 and charter a new internal IT organization that will compete with the original IT organization. And this happens regularly, in which case an internal micro enterprise can be put out of business if they do not support their internal customers. But at the same time, an internal micro enterprise has an advantage of the outside because they have the relationships and they have an understanding of contracting between the different enterprises. This is similar to actually a organization I worked with early in my career. It was an internal management consulting where we did technical computer programming. think back 40 years, much of what we do in Excel nowadays was actually programmed in Fortran. I was in the group that did that. But we did not have a corporate fund. We had to put together a budget each year by getting commitments from operating groups. And 10% of my time was actually spent wandering around the organization looking for problems that we can help them solve. And that was basically the same type of thing that Hire does here with the internal organization. For them to be successful as an internal staff function, they had to provide value to other parts of the organization. And this is done through networking of small units that are customer facing, and everything is customer facing here because the internal customers are just as important as facing to the outside external customer. And to the extent that sales sees something needed from the external customer, that then ripples through the direct connections to necessary parts, whether it be manufacturing to or an R&D or HR or IT to support that customer need. So immediately those customer needs can be then linked and diffused throughout the organization as necessary on a rapid basis without having to go into the organization silos up across and get necessary approval and budget to do things. Things happen much quicker because you got direct connection, direct accountability. Going forward then, this is actually distributed decision making that is at the customer interface. And this is a key component. We often talk about organizations need to be customer focused, but too often it's only part of the organization that is customer focused because they're the only ones that are dealing with it. There's not the interaction or the quick diffusion of communication across the organization that you find within a network structure. Let's take a look then a little bit more detail to the decision-making process itself. Within a causation, there is tight control over that decision-making and the decision-making rights. Within a distributed decision-making process, that becomes much more of effectuation, much more entrepreneurial, and those decisions can be addressed quicker through the relationships that they have and the ability they're able to pull resources together. It also gets into the goal process itself of the extent that goals have to be approved versus doing what you can with what you have available to you. Again, this gets into the flip process of the relationship between resources and goals, or what you can do with what you have versus what you need to get to the goal. So it's a different thought process. This is not to say that once an entrepreneurial organization becomes more traditional with a hierarchy and control function, some effectuation still contains in some decision, but for the most part is pushed out because it's very difficult to do effectuation in a controlled environment. Looking more then at the control and change functions, the things that happen below the waterline routinely. This is the change process and the levers that we have for that change process. We're now talking about effectuation thinking and how purpose can be aligned across the organization. We then talk about the change and control, again, how to separate first order control from, how to separate first order control from second and third order control such that we don't overlook the higher orders of control. We also then get into the point of what are the design elements necessary to put this type of organization together, and what does that mean for change and how organizations operate.